Hi, everybody. Hope you're doing marvelously well. This is an incredibly exciting interview for me because, well, you probably noticed a lot of the records I've been talking about and continue to talk about were produced by a handful of incredible producers and engineers. One of those is Mr. Stephen Street. Stephen Street was there in the early days with the Smiths, engineering and then producing the Smiths, worked with Morrissey. He worked with Blur on one of my favorite albums ever, Modern Life is Rubbish, and of course, Park Life and The Great Escape. I mean, he has worked with some of the most influential bands of the last 40 years. And I really, really am excited to talk to him today. So check out the interview with Mr. Stephen Street. Heaven Knows I'm Miserable Now was a single I bought when it came out. That was one of your first major?
Yeah, that was my first single with the Smiths. Basically, I was an in-house engineer at Island Records. Island Records had a basement studio called the Fallout Shelter, which is where I trained. So my first job was there. As you mentioned earlier, I was a bass player in the band. The band I was in wasn't really getting anywhere. I was a little bit disillusioned, but I knew that I'd liked making records, and I knew I enjoyed being in the studio. In fact, the band I was in, we had done some recording with Laurie Latham. So I'd actually sat next to him and watched him, and Laurie was doing pretty well at that time. He was doing the Blockhead stuff, with Ian during the Blockheads and breaking into some other things as well that were really interesting. So despite the fact that the record that we made didn't really do much, it gave me the taste of really wanting to be in the studio. So I kind of decided to at that time, I knew around at that time of the early 80s, that post-punk period, there was a lot of really good young engineer producers making their way, like Steve Lillywhite, Martin Russian, Martin Hannett, with all the factory stuff. And I thought, that's what I really want to do. I want to learn how to use the recording desk and learn to see if I can become good at that, because if I can become good at that and still retain some of the musicianship that I had, perhaps I might be lucky enough to become a record producer like those guys, So, but those guys really were known mostly for their sonic sound, what they applied to the record more than being a musical arranger, as it were. So I kind of, for a while, I decided to kind of put my music ability, which wasn't fantastic anyway, to one side and just purely focus, if I could, on learning to become a recording engineer. And fortunately, I managed to get a job at Island Records, and because they were just doing up their studio at the time, and I managed to kind of sweet talk the studio manager into giving me a break, and they were looking for a new assistant to help with the refit of the studio as well. So my first job when I did get in there was varnishing all the wood that was going up on the walls and everything. But it felt really good, it felt really good to be part of the team that was rebuilding this studio. And then I did start as a proper engineer there, assistant engineer there. And it was great because they didn't just treat me like a T-boy. I really was able to get my hands on the desk and learn how things worked. And the engineers I learned with there were very, very supportive. And so I learned a lot. And a lot of the time also, I was the only assistant. So I'd be working, doing edits and things for the label during the day. And then the session would start late afternoon, early evening, and I'd be on that for hours. And so it was pretty intensive. But to cut to what you just asked about with the Smiths. So what happened was I was at Ireland. I progressed to the point where I knew enough to kind of get by engineering a session. And the studio manager said to me, there's a band coming in at the weekend, because although the studio was normally given over to focusing on the Island Records stuff, they did sometimes at the weekends do work for other labels. And he said, we've got this band coming in from Rough Trade called the Smiths. Would you like to do the session? And I was like, yeah. Because I'd seen them on Top of the Pops doing This Charming Man literally about 2 weeks. And I read all the music press. I was a real kind of like Enemy, Sounds, Melody Maker. I was reading
Me
it all.
too.
So I was really aware of what they were. So I just went out of my way to be as impressive as I possibly could. And that session we did Heaven Knows I'm Miserable Now and Girl Afraid. And John Porter was the producer and I was the engineer. And they took my name and number at the end of the session. I remember Morrissey and Johnny kind of, saying they enjoyed it and took my name and number. And I thought, great. And then they did the next single, William, in a different studio with another engineer. So I kind of thought, well, that ship has sailed. I really thought that I'd missed out. But then a few months later, Jeff Travis phoned me and said, well, the band want to do their next album. They want to produce it themselves, but they want to work with an engineer that they like and trust. Would you be up for it? So that was it. So it was just me and the band going off to make that next record, Meters Murder.
Absolutely incredible. So it was great. You just answered my second question because you were talking about Martin Rushent and Laurie Latham, I think, is something I've heard you talk about in other interviews as somebody you sort of related to.
Yeah, well, I say because Laurie did do the album of the band I was in. I was in a band called BIM, which was that's just BIM.
BIM.
Okay. In fact, that band didn't really do very much, and we did do some recording with Laurie, and that's where I got my first taste of seeing a good engineer, knowing what he was doing. But although that band really didn't come to very much, out of that band came two people, myself and Cameron McVeigh, who went on to produce other things. Cameron met and married Nana Cherry. He was also instrumental in doing the first Massive Attack album. So,
Incredible.
Some good came out of that band, although we didn't actually achieve very much.
You mentioned briefly before we move on, just talking about assisting. When I look here at your credits, you've got Black Uhuru, you've got King Sunny Ade, Blancmange, John Martin, who I absolutely love as an artist. That's, as you said, a very, very fertile period, that sort of post-punk, late 70s, early 80s. We talk a lot about how much incredible music was made in that period. You're saying you did more as an assistant. Give us a little bit of an overview on those kind of albums. What were they having you do? Were you're running around... Well, the Black Uhuru stuff, I was working with a really good engineer called Paul Groucho Smykel. That a lot of that was mixing because the Black Uhuru stuff was done either at Compass Point or in Jamaica. Yep.
And a lot of it was Sly and Robbie. And so it was fantastic stuff to work on. I mean,
amazing.
The music, you just pushed up the faders and it sounded great. But Paul's skill was doing really good dub kind of mixes and things. So he would just fire off lots of different takes onto the Atari half-inch, and then I really would kind of do all the cutting and editing and doing all the kind of dub edit type things, the little reverse bits and all that kind of stuff.
Amazing.
So I got pretty good, dare I say so myself, with the razor blade and the tape. So I learnt my chops kind of editing quite quickly and got into that, and I kind of really enjoyed that. And in King Sunny Ade, that was with a guy called Godwin Logie, who again was another really good in-house engineer, and that was recording quite often. Bits and pieces on top of the main backing tracks were done often in Nigeria because he had a huge band. But it was really good fun doing that stuff, and I learned a lot kind of working on that kind of music. It made me appreciate where the groove should be and the space should be and so on. And there'll be the occasional session like someone like John Martin coming in to do a little bit of work. I only worked with him once. I mean, that's great research you've done there because I completely forgot that I did it.
I'm a huge John Martin fan. I think Solidaire is one of the greatest albums ever, and so. Yeah. And whenever I see his name, I'm always ask somebody.
Yeah, that's a great album, isn't it? But I mean, unfortunately, I got to admit, it wasn't a great session, that one. He wasn't in the best of shape, sure. Unfortunately. But also worked with John Cale. John Cale was an absolute angel to work with. That was fantastic. Incredible. So it was good stuff. But Ireland, it was a very supportive atmosphere to work in, and I learned a lot. But I'm very appreciative of the fact that really my first break was that getting, being on the kind of involved with the Smiths, because it really did open up so much for me.
Looking at your credit list, I mean, you went into production pretty quickly. Although I imagine being really super young, you probably thought it was slow. But you've got Stephen Duffy production credit same year.
Yeah. Well, Stephen was very talented, and he kind of knew a lot of what he wanted. We just hit it off. We went in the studio. Again, although, with Meters Murder, although I wasn't producing it, obviously I was making production choices because it was just me and the band. And it was just so, amazing. It would be up to me to get the kind of try and second guess what kind of sound they wanted for that particular track or whatever. And back in those days, what I would do would be, as soon as I kind of got everything plugged, microphones plugged in and was doing our takes, I would be choosing either a Lexicon or an RMX reverb to put on the snare to give it its sound, whatever, so that when they came in, they liked it, and if they did like it, I'd print that reverb, and I'd make a note of the program, what it was, and so on. So if I needed those tracks later on, if we were running short of tracks, I could go, well, at least I know what it was, and and then recreate it later on the mix. So already I was making kind of sonic decisions, as it were, as to what the overall sound would be for the records. So I guess you're stepping into a producer's kind of territory there slightly by doing that. And as I say, Stephen and I hit it off, and he was very much of the opinion. He had just done a session, I think, with the ZTT production team, which had cost a fortune.
I can imagine.
And he didn't have much of a budget left, and obviously I was cheap then, so I was involved as the engineer to work with him. And he gave me a production credit because, again, all these reasons I was telling you just then, I was making decisions that were kind of a producer's role, really. So and that was great. So that was a really good break to get. I also did a record with a band called Shockheaded Peters, which was a track called I Blood Brother B. It was for the L label, the EL label. And that was, I think that might be the very first single or the first record that I actually produced. And it was, that was a real kind of interesting thing to do, because I had this kind of jazz loop. Dum, 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 ba-dum. That's what it was. And I was just getting into kind of sampling little hits and things on the AMS. Remember the delay lines? You could get a little bit of sampling in there, like a little chickum, that snare thing. So I was kind of literally hitting this button all the way through this track and kind of creating this kind of loop. And it was fun, so I learned a lot. I mean, I'm sure you remember back then in the early 80s, there was so much new technology coming at us. All the drum machines, this thing called MIDI. No one knew what MIDI was 5 years previously. And then suddenly MIDI was just everywhere. So, we were having to learn that, as well as learning the mic techniques and so on and so forth. So there was a lot to kind of get hold of. But, if you threw yourself into it with enthusiasm and kind of absorbed everything you needed to absorb, it was a great time to be a recording engineer, really.
Yeah, you touched on something which wasn't in our list of questions, but is a great thing to talk about for a second. I almost feel like we were better at integrating electronic elements into organic music in those days than we are now. Yeah,
I think because there was an element of sometimes you get a Lin drum in, say, and it would be so expensive to hire for the day that you'd get as much as you could out of it, but then you'd realize later on that you need to kind of make it a bit more exciting. So, I mean, quite often, it would go, actually, the hi-hats are really pretty crap. So, you'd get a drummer to play along with a real hi-hat to kind of give it a bit more swing and so on. And there was this kind of, like MIDI would do so much, but obviously sometimes you're better off just kind of, you might have done something with the keyboard, but, for whatever reason, the MIDI isn't working that night. You haven't got the lead isn't working, whatever. And so you've got to play it manually. So there'd be a mixture of stuff that was sequenced, but there was also a fair bit of musicianship playing live on top. Whereas now, people working in Logic, they just hit the quantize button on everything straight away. I'm not saying everybody, but a lot of people do, because it instantly sounds tight and it's appetizing. But then when you listen back to it, it makes everything sound pretty lifeless, I think, in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like the obstacles that we had created better music as a result.
Exactly. You'd work around it, instead of just hitting quantize 16ths and onto the next track, So I agree with you on that in that respect.
So you've got a pretty long association with the Smiths here before going on to work with Morrissey solo. I mean, as a huge Smiths fan, I could probably turn this into the Smiths conversation. So I apologize. As a guitar player myself, I'm always in awe of Johnny's influences because they were so left of center with music of that time. I went to that famous Jubilee Gardens show when I was a kid, and I stood at the front and just watched Johnny with the Gretsch, country gentleman playing through, 120s and twins, just amps that weren't hip.
Sure. Yeah, he wasn't into being a rock and roll guitar player at all, Johnny. He really wasn't. But no, I mean, it was great because it was a really nice gradual progression for me because, as I said, with Meat is Murder, I'm the engineer, they were producing it. And then on The Queen is Dead, it was decided that Morrissey and Marr were going to produce it, but they gave me a production point. They didn't give me a credit, but they appreciated the fact that I was contributing.
It's amazing.
I did ask for it, which was always a bit kind of like scary. How do you ask an artist, can you give me a percentage and give me a point? But I did. I felt we had a really good session. We'd done a really good session. Everything was going great. And I just said to Johnny, look, if you could, would you consider it? And they did. So then I was, credited, with a production point, but without an actual, a physical credit on the sleeve. But then we get to Strangeways, and I am credited as a co-producer with Morrissey and Marr. So it was great. So it was a nice, gradual kind of
beautiful
curve. I was learning all the time. It really was. I look back at things that I'd done on the first album and thought, I could have done that better. I over EQ'd that, or I did this or whatever. So, I was learning all the time. But, when they split up after we did Strangeways, I really, really thought it was just a temporary split. And I just sent a cassette of some songs to Morrissey to use as potential B-sides, because there wasn't much left in the can, apart from the tracks we had recorded for the album. And then when he wrote back to me and said, actually, I want to do a solo record, and work with this material that you've given me, I was really kind of surprised. I mean, nicely surprised, but it was also a lot of pressure, But, in the back of my mind, I always thought, 18 months from now, whatever, 2 years, they're going to be back together again. This is just going to be, a one-off solo record or whatever, How wrong I was.
So with Johnny in particular, you were saying he was kind of, I suppose, pushing the boundaries on guitar stuff. I suppose as a guitar fan, I'm wondering, was he always trying to find out what was the latest and greatest? Obviously, John Porter is credited as producer on How Soon Is Now. Did you engineer that?
No, I didn't. No, that was done. That was a session that John did with a different engineer, and a great sounding session too. I've got to say, it was incredible. I mean, when they came in with that, and I heard that, I thought, wow, the older, the
bar has been raised.
Yeah, the bar's been raised. That's the expression I was looking for. Definitely. Yeah, it was like, well, we've got to keep striving forward and getting better and better. But I was very proud of the work I'd done with them when we went back in. That was that record, that track. How Soon Is Now was between Meter's Murder and The Queen Is Dead. So, that spurred me on, really. I just wanted to make sure that I kind of, did the best I ever possibly could for them. And it kind of paid off, I think. I think they did appreciate the efforts I put into working and recording them.
I often wonder, because it's all about, Johnny and Morrissey for, in the press, but what an incredible rhythm section.
Incredible. And I think that often gets overlooked, Mm-hmm. I really do. I was really saddened by all the court case and everything, and the way they kind of, Morrissey kind of dismissed, Mike and Andy, because I think they were an incredible incredible rhythm section. And Andy's bass lines were really crucial to the Smiths.
Agreed.
A bit like Entwistle in The Who, he would carry a lot more than just giving you the rhythm, and there'd be a lot of melody and counter melody there and so on. And, he's a great player, really, really fine player, Andy. And I was really saddened, actually, because I actually thought that Johnny and Morrissey got that wrong, the way they dealt with that court case. They should have given the guys a bit of a cut on that, on the royalties there that they asked for. And, but, that's not for me to say, really, because obviously, I don't want to be criticising Johnny and Morrissey too much, but that is how I feel personally. I just say, and they were just great musicians. That was the thing about the Smiths. They were that chemistry you get when you get four guys, or could be girls too, but you get four people in a room and they just got something about them that is really special. And I really experienced that with them. And I experienced it later when I met Blur. It's that same thing. You can't change any single one of them. There's something about every single one of them being really important.
What was the last album you did with Morrissey?
Well, that was it, really. So we'd done Viva Hate.
Yep.
And that was done very quickly. You think about it, the Smiths had broken up in, I think it was July of that year.
Yep.
87. And Strangeways came out late summer of that year. I got married in August, and that's when I got the postcard from Morrissey saying, I want to do the solo record. So we didn't actually go in the studio. So I dropped everything basically then. So I thought, I've got to work out how I'm going to go in the studio with Morrissey and make a record. So I had this session drummer guy that I'd worked with called Andrew Parisi. And I thought, okay, he can come in. I need to get a good guitar player in. I can play bass. I can play a bit of rhythm guitar. And at this point, I'd done already some work with Vinnie Riley from Druity Column. So I invited him in. A lot of people think that Morrissey invited Vinnie because he's Mancunian and he lives in Manchester, but it wasn't. It was me. I invited Vinnie to come and meet Morrissey. And I remember them meeting in my flat in Mortlake, which is kind of near Barnes in southwest London. And I was sitting there thinking, this is going to be, because they're both quite difficult people in their own way. And I was dreading it going really, really badly, but it kind of worked okay. So they met. I thought, great, we'll go in the studio. And we went to the Warhol and we did the first session, which was in September, late September. And in that session, we did Suede Head. So I thought, I've got that in the can. And I knew. And there were some other tracks we recorded. So a couple of them worked. Suede Head was one. A couple of others were okay, but I then knew that we had to kind of keep chipping away. And in fact, we wrote better songs. And so a couple of those very early tracks got dismissed and they've turned up on bootlegs and things and so on. You think about it. So we've done a session in September. We take 2 or 3 weeks off for me to go home and write more ideas to send to Morrissey, because he likes to kind of just work up, in his room with a cassette and do his thing. And then we met back in the studio in November and did the main session. Yeah, that's where we did the rest of the album. And then that record was done, pretty much written, recorded, and finished before Christmas of that year, which is pretty quick turnaround. And I was having to engineer it, play bass in it, show the band the song, show Andrew and Vinny the song. Try and second guess Morrissey. Is he happy? Is the key okay? Are we doing the right feel? I mean, it was really hard work. And in the end, I actually kind of felt pretty ill towards the end. It was a lot of pressure. And then I went home for Christmas that year. And then early 88, I didn't hear anything from Morrissey for about 2 months, until Suede Head came out, and it was single of the week in all the papers. I mean, and then he got in touch with me again and said, Stephen, is it okay to go back in the studio? I've got some more ideas. So it was like, so we went back in the studio and we did another session. And in fact, those songs we did in that session were great. We did We'll Never Marry, Sister, I'm a Poet, and Disappointed. And all that, if those tracks had been on the album, it would have been a killer. I mean, Viva Hate is, it has its flaws, but it was such a quick turnaround that I was very proud of it. We achieved a lot by making that record. And I also knew that, if that record came out and it was a stinker, I would be Public Enemy #1, because the Smiths was so revered,
Absolutely.
So I felt a lot of pressure too. And I know Morrissey did too. I've got to give him credit. I mean, he must have been very scary for him. It must have been incredibly scary, because here he is, stepping out now on his own. There was that session, and then we went back in later on that year and we called it More Work, Last International Playboys and Interesting Drug, and all the B-sides that went with it. So I think in an 18-month period, Morrissey and I kind of co-wrote over 35 songs or something. It was ridiculous. It was incredible.
And in that period, I mean, it sort of, I think from a fan's perspective, it sort of blurs into the Smiths catalog. It has a continuity that we absolutely loved. And even though the band had broken up, which was quite depressing, obviously, from a fan's perspective, and not hearing Johnny play, it just had this song after song after song. So, the pressure must have been immense. But also congratulations for co-writing some really freaking amazing songs.
No, I'm proud of them. I think they're good. I think those first 4 Morrissey solo singles are damn good releases, and they're all very different as well from each other as well, which is good, I think.
Every Day is Like Sunday. We haven't talked about that for a second. I mean, that's a absolute masterpiece.
Well, that was from the album session proper. That was from the Viva Hate session album, and I always knew that was a killer. I mean, that for me, that was a song written around the bass line. That was me writing a song that was trying to be like Echo and the Bunnymen. I really loved Echo and the Bunnymen, and I thought, is it Les Patterson, the bass player? I think it's Patterson, isn't it? Forgive me, but I mean, the bass lines and all the Bunnymen songs, especially the early ones, were fantastic. They really propelled the song along, and really that was what I kind of wrote that track around. But it's nothing. It's funny because Vinny was a bit snobby about things, so another song with C, F and A minor and G in it. And I was like, well, I'm sorry, Vinny, but that's what the chords are for this song. If you don't like it, it's that, and he was sometimes a bit sniffy about it, but what can I say? It's a classic song construction, and classic chord structure, and it works.
But none of those songs are generic. I mean, that's always the thing that both Morrissey and, of course, the Smiths had, is they had a way of interpreting it. It's interesting, being two English guys, two British guys talking about British bands. But the thing about the Smiths, as English as they were, you can hear so much American influence in it. It's like all these great songwriters, Johnny's love of all these great kind of, country and jazz players. And it was very different to what the 80s was about, because mid-80s in the whole world was, was more gated. It was very much more electronic, at least the birth of like super electronic stuff. And here we had, a band that was virtuoso musicians writing classic songs.
Yeah. I mean, in fact, it wasn't until the third album, Strangeways, where we managed to kind of really kind of start getting. Actually, no, on The Queen Is Dead, we got a little bit of keyboards. I mean, there was keyboards on the very first album. That was just Hammond organ, though, I think. But the Morrissey was very much against synths being used, initially. But then, as time went on, Johnny was very keen to kind of explore different flavors and in fact the very first track on Strangeways, there's no guitar at all on that track. It's Johnny playing keyboards, and I thought that was really bold. He said, we're going to really scare, shock everybody. We're going to have a song without Johnny Marr playing guitar. It's just Johnny playing keyboards, and a rush and a push, and the land is ours. That track, and I thought it was really bold. And it does sound great. It was again, I was very much into the use, as all the engineers were in those days, different delay times, signatures to give that I'd put on the piano to make it dun digga dun dun digga dun. You get all these kind of movement things by applying different delays and so on to liven up perhaps what might have been a bit of a flat kind of keyboard part. But it was, I learned a lot by using delays and reverbs like everybody did in the 80s. But I think the way we applied it hasn't aged quite as badly as some of those 80s records have, with the overuse of gated reverbs and so on.
I agree. I think that it depended on how it was done, wasn't it? Because, if you think of like Hughes records, he was using the actual natural room sound and the console, manipulating it, where I think some of the stuff that sounds super dated to me is where it's obviously just a triggered sample triggering a lexicon verb and a gate. Yeah. It doesn't have that rough randomness of an actual person performing,
Exactly. Yeah.
It's interesting how sometimes the original idea is always incredible, but then it gets diluted by successive people trying to imitate it. I think I feel like I'm happy to jump a little bit further along, because you were super busy with Morrissey, you're super busy. Mighty Lemon Drops, where we could talk about. I mean, that's a wonderful, wonderful band that I don't hear enough people mentioning. That was in the middle, and the Blue Aeroplanes. Oh God, that's a blast from the past.
Yeah, I can't remember doing much with it. I think I might have just done one track or something. Obviously with the success that I had with the Smiths and Morrissey, there was obviously interest to work with other kind of guitar bands, and so I was that was where my reputation was beginning to be formed. As a producer, of working with young, guitar kind of type, indie, whatever you want to call it, alternative bands. I was learning all the time. I was picking up new, tricks and of the trade and so on. And I just remember though, just being completely in awe of the Pixies album that Gil Norton had done though, Surfer Rosa, when that came out. Again, that was a great use of ambient space and so on. So, there were certain records that came out, you thought, wow, I wish I could make a record as good as that, or whatever. You were really inspired by certain records like that particular one. And I also started my own little label called Foundation, and I had some acts on there, one of which is a band called Bradford, who I'm now part of. Just put a new album coming out actually on Friday this week. Nothing was really kind of registering as big as the Smiths. So it was kind of, in a way, I wouldn't say a fallow period, but I wasn't kind of, it was, and then Morrissey had stopped working with me, which was obviously a shame and a bit of a kind of, it hurt a little bit, it'd gone on, started working with other people. And so it was kind of tough for a little bit. But I had that good fortune of discovering this band called Blur. And normally, as you know, as a record producer, at least back then anyway, you'd either be approached by the A&R person that signed the band or the manager of the band, and and you'd be put in, would you like to work with this group? Yes. Okay, here you go, off you go. Here's the budget, bang. But in this case, what happened was I'd heard the Blur's, the first Blur single, She's So High, and I really liked it. And I saw a video of them. I thought, they look like they're interesting. They've got something about them that's really, really cool. So my manager, Gal Colson, she was managing Jesus Jones, and they're on the same label as Blur in the UK, at least, on Food Records. So I said to Gal, when you're going to see the people at Food, let them know that I'd be interested in working with them, which she did. But the band initially said they were going to do their next single with the original production team that had done the first one. But for whatever reason, that hadn't worked out. So they came back and said, yes, we would like to meet Stephen. So I went in and met them. We went for a drink. It was decided we'd go in the studio the following week and do something as a kind of test session. And we went in, and that first session we did together was There's No Other Way. So it kind of, by this time, there'd already been about, I think we're already 2/3 of the way making, their first album, Leisure. So it was like, wow. And in fact, that was it. That was the same time I was working with the first, because I literally done this session the very first week of January of that year. I think it was 91. And then I had to go off to New York for two months. And then when I came back from New York, after working with the Furs, There's No Other Way was on the radio everywhere, and it was a huge hit. So it was suddenly like, bang, it had really taken off, So, and that was the start of a very long working relationship. Although really, it kind of nearly stumbled, because I made Leisure and There's No Other Way, and then we did another single called Bang, which wasn't as good. And in fact, when the band came, they went off and toured America. It's kind of well documented. Everybody kind of thought they were from Manchester, although they weren't. And, and they came back kind of pretty much demoralized and broke, really. But David Balfe at Food Records wanted them to make the second album with Andy Partridge from XTC.
I remember.
So they, so I was out the frame. I was really upset, because I was really hoping that I was going to get the call for the next album. So they started Modern Life, what would become Modern Life is Rubbish, with Andy Partridge. And it was a chance meeting. I'd gone to the Marquee in London to check out this new Irish band called the Cranberries, to see if I'd like to work with them, because Island Records had approached me to say, this new band, and would you like to work? And so I said, well, I'd like to see them play live if I could. And they were doing a show, so I went along. It just so happened while I was there, Graham Coxon was in the audience, and he was looking a bit down and everything. And I had a little pep talk with him, and I said, Graham, what's the matter? He said, it's not going great, we're really struggling, blah, blah, blah. And I just kind of said to him, look, you're a fantastic guitar player. I love yours playing. You're brilliant. The band's brilliant. You're going to be okay. He must have gone back and said to Damon, I saw Streety last night, and Damon kind of, well, I suppose they discussed it, and Damon kind of, next thing I know is I get a call from Damon saying, would you like to meet up and talk about the possibility of working together again? So it nearly didn't happen, getting involved in Modern Life is Rubbish, and that was the real proper start of our long-term relationship.
Well, it's no secret to anybody who's ever watched any of our videos that I consider Modern Life is Rubbish as one of the most important albums of the 90s. Especially for Britain. I mean, I was in bands at the time, and when that album came out, we were just, because it was another guitar album, but it was like the sounds that Graham was getting, just made it exciting again to be into guitar bands. Because I think probably for Americans watching this, they must understand that electronic music was getting massive in Britain from the late 80s on. It might not have happened for another 10 years over here in the US, but there. So having an exciting guitar band come out, because Leisure's a great record, like you said, There's No Other Way is a fantastic hit song, but Modern Life is Rubbish is just covered with like sonic treats of just, I absolutely love it. We've done a whole episode just on the record, just sitting with Graham talking about it.
Sure.
Huge fan. So yeah, it's a shame with the Andy thing, also being an XTC fan, and I'm sure there's nothing negative to be said about it. It was an experiment.
I was a huge XTC fan myself. I think I've got the first 5 albums in my collection. I love them. I was a huge fan. But
artists don't always make the best producers.
This is it. This is, as far as I know, it just wasn't working for whatever reason. And then, and luckily I'd met Graham that night. So, it was fateful really. And it was kind of meant to happen, I guess.
Where did you track it? Where did you track the record?
Well, we did everything at Maison Rouge, which was a studio in Fulham. It was great in those days. You get a budget and you go in a studio and it'd be a big studio and you could be in there from the beginning to the very end, not like now.
We had a studio called Studio Poisson for exactly the same reason. We're like, well, Maison Rouge, everybody's going to think it's in some chateau in the south of France. Yeah. So we thought we'll call ours Studio Poisson. Yeah. So we were just trying to copy you, that's all.
But it was I think it was a studio that was started by Jethro Tull, Ian Anderson.
Was it? I didn't know.
Yeah. He's the guy that first built it. But by then he wasn't involved in it anymore, and it was an independent little studio. The main reason why the band wanted to record there was they were so broke, they had hardly any money. And what was happening was the guy who ran it was basically giving them a little bit of money back. So you'll say, I'll charge EMI X amount per day, and I'll give you a little bit back. So you got some spending money. So... But it was a good studio and it was well equipped, and there was a good engineer working there called John Smith, who was very good. We were a good team, and the band were really keen. They'd been driven on. I think how driven Damon is. And they'd come back from this tour of America, broke. The manager had ripped them off. Their old previous allegedly had ripped them off, and what of course had happened was when they came back from America, all of a sudden this band called Suede were suddenly exploding, and Damon was like, "I'm not going to get left behind. This is because everyone could see that Suede were very exciting. They were. I mean, those, that opening kind of salvo of singles they put out were just mind blowing. And it was like, okay, this is it. Perhaps, as you just rightly said, Warren, there was that thing back then in the early '80s. It was either really kind of mindless kind of dance music or grunge. There was kind of no, or big selling acts like Annie Lennox or Phil Collins or Tina Turner. It was real kind of, it just wasn't, there was nothing new coming through from the youth, as it were, or from, it was, I mean, I've been watching some of those kind of Top of the Pops that they show, which are the late 80s, early 90s, and they're just so painful to watch, so many of them, because, it's just really formulaized dance music that was really badly made. Samples over everything, but just crap, basically.
Yep.
And so this was a real charge of a new talent coming through that was tapping back into that lineage of guitar bands from the Beatles and the Stones through the
Kinks,
Jam and the Kinks, and it was a kind of a real, you could see this lineage coming through. The songs were coming back again,
Yep.
And that's what we really grasped and kind of clung to while we were making Modern Life is Rubbish. We didn't worry about whether it was going to be done to a click and be danceable, or whether it was going to be this, or it was whatever the song needs, we'll go down that route and we'll do it. And that's what we did. And it's funny because when we finished initially the session for Modern Life is Rubbish, David Balfe from Food came in. Balfe was like the head of the label, and said, "Well, it's rubbish. It's not going to sell. It's going to sell to a few NME readers, and it's crap. You've got to start." It's he really washed his hands of it. He didn't like it at all. So we sat there because we were excited, thinking he's going to like it, and we were just kind of completely like, "Oh my god!" And it was really a downer. It really was. And this was just before Christmas. And what happened was Damon went home for Christmas and thought, "Right, I'm going to write 2 more songs. We're going to come back with 2 more hits." And bless him, in a way, Balfe was right, because it forced Damon to go away and write 2 new songs. One was called For Tomorrow, and one was called Chemical World, and they really did help push the album up to the next level. So it worked out in the end,
Yeah, what a great opening song. And, you go to any Blur show, just that la, 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 la. I mean, everybody's a total sing-along moment. Yeah, it's, to me, from a musician's perspective, being in bands at that time, it gave us, exactly what you're saying, it gave us the green light to do what we wanted, to mess around, like, be like Graham, start playing around with pedals and come up with different sounds. And mind you, people got to remember, this is before the bends. This is before Radiohead the Bends. So and as much as I love Johnny Greenwood and he's incredible, Graham was doing this a couple of years before, and he was.
Graham's use of guitar pedals is incredible. He's amazing. He will write a part around what he's doing with his feet. The Oily Water is a perfect case in point. I've never seen a person use pedals like that so much. I mean, normally someone might go, okay, I'm going to have this delay on and this kind of flange for the verse, and then on the chorus, I'm going to change to something else. But he actually, within a riff, will be using one or two different pedals. So it'll be going, he'll just be mixing and matching, his pedal work to create a riff rather than just doing it, purely with his fingers. It's incredible, absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
And then you've got this classic songwriting that Damon would be coming through with, which has got, as I say, the lineage of Ray Davies and Bowie and so on, and then Graham doing his thing, which is completely trying to fight against that a little bit and being abstract just for the hell of it. And then you got Alex just being groovy as hell, and he plays bass like a lead guitarist as well. And Dave being really solid and great on the drums. So it's just a really good chemistry. And, I'm just very proud of that record, because it really did open up a new chapter, not only just for Blur, but for a lot of kind of guitar-based bands in that period.
Yeah, I remember vividly. It was, as far as I'm concerned, it really was the birth of Britpop in the way that, the way that we really see it. It was like we were okay to own our past and put it together. Like you say, Alex, you can tell he must have listened to Peter Hook. You can tell he was influenced by that. But then the songwriting was super like 60s influence, like we're saying, those big hooks. And yet the guitar playing was like twisted and weird. I mean, it's a great time for music. How long did it take to make the record?
We had a bit more time in those days. I mean, like now, everything's kind of got to be done, budgets are so much tighter. But I would say it was probably 8 to 10 weeks, something like that. One thing I'm really kind of proud to say is that I've never gone over budget ever on any record I've made. I've always been very conscientious of how much has been spent in the studio. I've worked with some people over the years who didn't think twice about having a big stack of gear just sitting there by the side of the desk that was costing a fortune every day and not worried about it. I, however, have always been of the opinion that it's not the record company's money we're spending. Actually, it's the artist's money we're spending, because that record company are paying initially, but it's all going to be marked off against the band, and they've got to recoup that. So ultimately, it's the band's money that's being spent. So I was always very kind of conscious of making sure that I always try to keep the sessions flowing so that they were always, we're making good use of the time. And this is the other thing that I kind of went through as well. I'd learned over the years, especially when I was working at Ireland, sometimes I was doing very late night sessions, and I thought, when I'm the producer and I'm in charge of it, I'm not going to do that, because I could tell that you didn't get any more work done when you're working late at night. There was just a more chance that things would be kind of go off on a tangent. And so I would start my working day with the guys in Blur, and we'd start, say, around about 10 in the morning and get to about 9 or 10 at night. And I'd say, right, guys, go home, see your girlfriends for a couple of hours, and then be back the next day and keep fresh, rather than kind of working all the way through the night. Because if you go through the night, all it means is that you start late the next day,
Yeah.
And in fact, that's a kind of principle of the working day as such, which Damon, as you know, is the most kind of productive person out of everyone that I've ever met. It does to this day. He gets in the studio at 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning. He works till 6 and he goes home. And he is, as I say, he puts out more music than anyone else I know.
Yeah, more varied music.
Yeah,
insane.
Yeah.
You probably saw. I'm assuming you saw the song number 2 video that Graham and I did. Did you see that?
Yeah, I did. Yeah,
that was ridiculously successful as a video, because it was actually Eric's idea, who's sitting over there, who's a 25-year-old American guy who's probably 24 at the time, and just said, you guys should quickly talk about song number 2. So we're like, okay. And we did it super off the cuff. We managed to get like some stereo stems of just the basic elements to listen to. And it's incredible how much bleed is in Damon's vocal mic.
Absolutely.
And so Graham remembers it as everybody in the control room.
Well, that was interesting, that album, because that album there was a desire after the Modern Life, Park Life, and then The Great Escape to do something a bit different. And so I was kind of fully expecting that if they were going to do something very different, that I might be given the old heave-ho, but fortunately I wasn't. But they did want to do things differently. I thought, great, I'm going to bring something to the party. Then I'm going to try and bring something that makes us think in a different way. So I went and bought myself quite a big cost at the time, 16 tracks of this thing called Radar. Do you remember Radar?
I do remember Radar, yeah.
And this was an incredible sounding digital, a hard drive recording system. The converters were incredible. And more importantly, it operated like a tape machine. I was really kind of like there was already beginning to be a little bit of this thing of looking at a computer screen all the time. And I didn't want that. I wanted to sit at the desk with a remote next to me that had 1 to 24. So I was used to it, and I could just hit the buttons I was going to record on, and it just felt very natural. But the great thing about it is that you could easily mark in and mark out, and you hit loop, and it would just do this. And I wanted to create a drum loop. Song 2 is one of there's always a punky or a couple of punky songs on a Blur album. And there was no pressure. This was just a song that the band were going to let rip on. So I had the idea, so let's get like a lo-fi drum loop to kind of start off the track. Dave and Graham were out in the playing area. There was 2 drum kits up at different ends of the room for slightly different sounds. And they were playing this rhythm between the 2 of them. But I only recorded it using the room mic. Recorded it on the Radar, marked in, marked out, looped it, said, right, let's record on top of that. And we just went for it. And it came together in one afternoon. Graham he was just playing in the control room. So was Alex. And Damon just had a handheld, SM58 and let him rip. And I think the original demo for that song was that Damon was going, it's like a whistle. But then with all this cacophony of sound going off, the only thing he could be heard over this noise was to go, woo! And of course, everyone went, hey, that's really quite a strong hook because it's such a universal thing. And I think Damon tried to write more kind of sensical lyrics because it's just a stream of God knows what coming out of him while he's kind of jumping around the room doing that. And we went to Iceland to do most of the vocals for that record, and he tried to come up with lyrics that kind of made more sense rather. It just didn't have the same vibe. So in the end, some of that vocal at the very end is some of the live guide vocal that was used. Yeah.
Why Iceland?
Again, that was the desire to do something different. Damon really wanted to do everything outside of London, but Graham put his foot down and said, I've been on the road touring for the last year. He just bought himself a house in Camden and he didn't want to record out of London. He wanted to be in London. So the compromise was that we would record at Mayfair Studios, which is not in Mayfair, as you may remember, but it's actually in Primrose Hill.
Yeah.
And so we did. So that was the first album that we did outside of Maison Rouge. But so we did the tracking at Mayfair, but then Damon wanted to go to somewhere completely out there somewhere, and we came up with the idea of going to somewhere like Iceland, and that's where we went there.
It's about as opposite of London as you can imagine.
Yeah.
Let's just go to Iceland.
Because it was really quite different then. There wasn't much tourism in Iceland at all. It was really, it's become quite a trendy place to go to now, but back then it was really off the beaten track. It's
interesting when I did the video, people, because Graham and I kind of looked at each other and did that English thing like, what? And he's like, And everybody was like, what are they talking about? The hidden meaning of the lyrics. And there was this whole discussion. And I know Graham said to me, he was just making up things on the spot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But he had an attitude, But that's a good thing about it. That song came out of the ether. It really did. It just, we didn't sit there and deliberate and go, oh, pressure. We've got to make it a hit single. And that's why it's so good. That's why it's got so much freedom. In it, and it just goes for it because it's actually just the band letting off a bit of steam, really, and it's been captured.
Yeah, it's a wonderful all round, great piece of production, great mix. A really good mix. It just
I always remember we're halfway through making that record. The band had a gig in Dublin. And it was a gig. It was a small festival. I think Black Grape were there as well. Sean Ryder's new band and stuff. Yep. Halfway through the gig, they said, "Let's play that new one. Let's play song 2." And they played it, and the audience just went. didn't know what to make of it at all because it was only 2 minutes. It started and stopped, and they played it really fast as well. And it went down like a lead balloon. The audience went, yeah, but then obviously, as we know, it took on a life of its own after a while.
If you've got time, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about some stuff like Sleeper. You did in the middle of all this Blow stuff as well. Another absolutely great band of that period. Probably a band as a result of Blur, probably made it okay for them to come out and make some great music.
I mean, Sleeper, I think a really good band. I mean, they kind of got a little bit dismissed by some of the music press as being like second division Britpop, but I don't agree with that at all. I think Louise is a great writer. Her lyrics are always really, pin sharp. They're really, really good. And as you might know, I've actually worked with them again fairly recently when they reformed and did a new album with them. Initially, I was approached by them to help them. I mixed In Betweener, which was the single from their first album, and they really liked how that worked out. So then I was called in to produce the second album, The It Girl, which was great. And, I'm a big fan of pop music. I like guitar music and I like pop music. And I think that's the thing about Blur and Sleeper. And again, some people kind of treat Britpop as a dirty word these days. But, it's a great amalgamation of popular music done with a bit of attitude, and it's made in Britain. So that's why it's called Britpop, I mean, Echo and the Bunnymen and the Cure and the Smiths were Britpop, but they were just 10 years earlier,
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned. But I really enjoyed working with them. Great players. John Stewart, man, he's a great guitar player, actually. He knows his chops, he really does. And as I said, Louise, as a lyricist, I think she's fantastic. So I really enjoyed
did some shows with them. My band opened up for them. They were always amazing live.
Yeah, really, really good. And, again, that came from that kind of slight lineage of the Pixies and that kind of stuff as well, kind of, nice heavy kind of choruses after a slightly chilled out verse or whatever. But, at the same time, I was working with all that kind of Britpop stuff. What was really working for me globally was the Cranberries. Yeah. There was this band, that, as I said, I alluded to earlier, which, when I was doing Modern Life is Rubbish, I was kind of in the studio doing some tracks with Blur. Then I was flying over to Dublin and doing a little bit of work with the Cranberries on their first album. And, and that album, when it first came out, it completely bombed. No one wanted to know it, It just completely bombed. And it wasn't until Linker took off on Alternative Nation, which was like a little segment that was on MTV in America back in the early 90s, that it took off and had a life of its own. I mean, the band nearly broke up. They were just touring Europe with Hothouse Flowers, thinking we're going to get dropped any minute, And as we all know, it went on and just became this huge success. But, I was very proud of those records because I didn't make Blur sound like the Cranberries, and I didn't make the Cranberries sound like Blur. I approached each band completely differently.
One of many reasons why I admire your work. There's a couple of guys, you and John Leckie, I admire for very similar reasons. When I listen to both your guys' albums, I don't hear your style. I hear the best that the band can be. And I think
that's the point, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a really powerful thing for a producer that gets a little bit lost in the technology these days because of the way we have more control than we've ever had. As producers and engineers, we can make decisions that completely change, sometimes for the best, but can completely ruin a band's groove, feel, everything. It's interesting for me because that's maybe a little bit of an art that's lost or isn't appreciated. It's maybe a better way of saying. It's like bringing out the best of a band. For all of the British people here, we can't really ignore the fact that Parklife was like an absolutely massive game changer in the mid-90s. I think for us in the musical community, we'd already fallen in love with, with the previous album. So it was no surprise to us that Parklife would be so huge. But it sort of began that sort of Blur Oasis thing, wasn't it? It was like the birth of this sort of rivalry between the two bands.
Yeah, although when we started Parklife, I mean, Oasis weren't even thought of at all, really. I mean,
no, exactly.
They hadn't really they were beginning to break through. But we started on Parklife within just 2 or 3 months of finishing Modern Life is Rubbish. Literally. Wow. I mean, I remember Modern Life is Rubbish coming out in, I think it was March, and they played the Reading Festival that following August.
Yep.
And although Modern Life is Rubbish hadn't been a commercial success, when they played in that tent at Reading, the undercurrent of feeling in that tent was this band is really going somewhere. But by that point, we had already made a start on recording certain tracks for the Parklife album. It was an album that we did initially. There was a couple of little tracks done in advance. I think we did Jubilee in the first session and Parklife itself. But we completely got. I got sick of it. That particular track, it was put to one side, and because the pressure was like, it's got to be a single. It's got to be a single, and so because of that, we approached it wrong. It felt really lifeless. It didn't feel right. So that was kind of pushed to one side. Now, the way it worked back then was that for the band to do a track in the studio with me, they would have to do a demo of the songs and then play them to the label, and then Food Records would say, you can do that one, that one, and that one with Stephen, and off you go. So we'd gone in to do a session and we'd done a few songs and we were making good time. So I said, have you got anything else to kind of play me? And Damon played me this little very basic demo he'd done with a drum machine. He did very basic demos, which I love about him. He just thinks about the song. He doesn't get hung up about how it sounds or anything. Just
great.
Bang.
Yeah, wonderful.
And I was like, this is great. The chorus, it's such a kind of, it's just a hook straight away. And I really like the simple approach. And I said, let's do this as a 120 BPM disco record, with electronic drums and a synthesized bass line, and just play to that and make it this approach this one differently, And we did it. And that came once Graham got that lovely swooping guitar thing over it, and Alex was doing his John Taylor impersonation on bass. It was just like, wow, this track is really, great. And I always remember the next day, Andy from Food Records, Andy Ross, phoned me and kind of said, how's it going, Stephen? Is the session going great? And I said, yeah. I said, oh, by the way, Andy, yesterday we did this song called Girls and Boys. And there was this kind of, you've not been told to do that one. And I was like, well, perhaps I had an idea for another producer to do it. I don't know. I said, well, we have, and I think you're going to like it. And fortunately, I was right. And so it was the first single from that album, But yeah, it was a great time making Parklife. And the great thing I love about Blur, and it's the same thing I had with the Smiths, is that you listen to one of their albums and the songs aren't the same at all.
That's what I was about to say.
And that, again, it's that lineage like the Beatles did with the White Album.
Yeah.
It could be a kooky country song and a song that's got a harpsichord on it, and then a song that's really heavy as hell. And I love that. That's why that's the kind of albums I love making, because they're much more interesting to make.
Yeah, I think if you were to take all the big music critics in the world and say, name your top 10 albums, that most people would probably put Revolver at the number one album. And what's the genre of Revolver? Is it,
Exactly,
is it here, there, and everywhere? Is it strings, or is it horn sections? Got to Get You Into My Life? Is it, Eleanor Rigby?
Is it Tomorrow Never Knows? I mean, is that? And again, that's what I love.
Man, like indie rock almost sounds like. Yeah,
but that's the sign of any great band. The best bands like Blur and the Smiths can do that, and people will still go, but that is still the band. That is still the sound of that.
I agree. I miss that. I feel like there was a sort of movement, particularly in the US in the mid-90s, where it was like you got the single and then there was 9 songs that sounded like
variations on the theme.
Variations on the same drum sound, same guitars and everything. Girls and Boys, it's one of those things I remember it coming out, and it to me it was like, yes, there was kind of the John Taylor kind of Duran Duran-y thing. A lot of people talking about that, but it also just like screamed Bowie at me. It just sounded like this is something Bowie would do.
Yeah. I mean, there is that. It's I'm a huge Bowieite, I really am, and so I often tap into my kind of what would have Bowie done, what would have Mick Ronson done, kind of vibe.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I'll tell you the other person that often, the other act, I should say, that kind of inspires me, and I think you might have heard that a little bit on things like Charmless Man, is Ian Hunter, Mott the Hoople. I really like those great kind of glam pop rock singles. That was very much the inspiration for me when I was producing For Tomorrow. Those kind of the girl singers, I wanted them to be like the Thunder Thighs, who were like the girl singers and all those Mott the Hoople records. I actually use that as a term of reference when I was, working with these girl singers, and said, that's the kind of thing I want, So I'm a bit of a glam rock pop kid at heart, really, and so
it's hard not to be. It was a great time. It's also just incredible how many like genres were just kind of like flipping over every 6 months to a year in Britain.
You couldn't stand still back then. In the UK, I mean, time was just moving. I mean, like there'd be a new genre, a new kind of, zeitgeist that would be. I mean, look at the ska thing. That came out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Everything was ska for a while, and then that disappeared, and then New Romantic was in, and then I mean, it was just fantastic. A great time to be a young person, really, because it was really inspiring. There's always something new coming along. Whereas really, a lot of stuff now is around for year upon year upon year upon year, and doesn't really change much.
Yeah, I think there's this feeling that you have to sort of maximize and monetize.
Yeah, I mean, you get this thing now about it's got to fit in with the Spotify algorithm, and I hate all that. You've got to be put on one of their playlists. It's got to be a certain thing, and you can't step outside that. That doesn't interest me at all. It really doesn't.
I often wonder though, with that kind of stuff, if it's self-prophesizing as well, because people are afraid to take chances, so they don't take chances, and they're like, well, it's because, and then they use excuses. You know what I mean? I work with a lot of artists that are afraid to push boundaries because we won't fit in this particular bracket that we want to be in, which is a real shame. Now, you were talking about using radar on song number 2 and how that allowed you to loop. How do you think, like with modern technology, DAWs, I assume you're using Pro Tools. Do you use Pro Tools, or what do you use?
Yeah, I mean, I was an early adopter of radar because, as I said, I did not like the idea of pushing a mouse around and staring at a screen for too long. And I wanted a system that operated and felt like a tape machine, albeit with easy editing, kind of facilities. And so, and I kind of resisted using Pro Tools for many, many, many years. But it became obvious to me when we got into the early 2000s that really I had to kind of learn it. And I didn't want to get left behind, because it was obvious to me that it was becoming like the industry standard. Took to it really, and kind of immersed myself in learning how to use it. I don't know all the shortcuts. I mean, there's kids out there who know bang, 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 they can do it. I mean, I'm like Command Shift, but mm-hmm. I know how I want to use it. I know enough to do what I want to do. And what I found is that initially, when I first got Pro Tools, it's like, oh wow, we can quantize all the drums and we can do this, beat detected. Do you know, I don't use it at all now. I use what I do with Pro Tools, and it's especially how I use it when I was using things, recording bands like Baby Shambles, for instance, is that it just enabled me to edit very quickly between live takes. And that's what I love about it. I can do playlist, and I can go, that chorus was great there, that one was great there, and I can cut things, and that's what I love about it. So ironically, although you could use it and quantize everything and do everything to a click, at the same time, it also frees up this thing that you can actually, if you want, just let people play as live as you want, and then you can do get them out of the room, and you can spend a bit of time cutting it together and getting what you want out of it. Back in the day, if you remember, Warren, tape was very expensive, wasn't it? So you got a few bunch. This is another thing where I was getting back to cost. I mean, I can remember some bands turning up at Maison Rouge, and the corridor was full of tapes. And I'm going, what? No, we would have 4 songs at least on every reel, masters, because we would go, that is a bit of tape we're allocating to this song. Do a take. Is it good enough? No. Rewind. Go over it. Is it good enough? No. And there was a pressure on. It was like, get it right. And the good thing about Pro Tools is obviously you can just go take after take. But I still say you can't beat actually having a piece of paper and a pencil there and making notes while the band are doing the takes and actually knowing where the best bits are. Because after a while, if you do too many takes and then sit back and then try and listen to them all over again, you start getting really bloody confused, So, but I'm a big lover of Pro Tools, and the plugins now are getting really good. I've got to say, I mean, I love the UAD stuff. Really do. The reverbs and delays are great. And as you know, we're all getting pushed now on budgets. So the chance of going in a studio where you've got all the gear and everything, you can only be in those studios perhaps for a little bit of time while you're doing the drums and so on. And after a while, you're expected to be in your own little kind of smaller studio, And that's where we are now, unfortunately.
I assume by that you have a home studio?
I've got a small home studio here, but I've actually got a studio now, which is my studio, which is set up in the same building where Damon is. So it's managed by Moloko, who are kind of big studio chain. What happened was is that I guess around about the early 2000s, the engineer I was working with a lot back then was Chenzo Townsend, who's now gone on to become a really good mix engineer. And he and I put all our gear together, and we were looking for a little bit of space. And we were working a lot at Olympic, and we asked them, have you got any space that we could take over and put our gear into? And they had this kind of old area in the basement, which went partly under the pavement. Remember those pavements that got those glass tiles in?
Yeah. Yep.
Outside shops and things. And so the little bit of light came in through those. And so we converted this little room downstairs in the basement at Olympic, and we called it the bunker. And I put all my gear in, and he put all his gear. We had an API desk. No, it wasn't API. an Audient desk.
I was talking to Andy this morning, and he said to ask you about whether you still have what's it called, a Zen?
Zen, I still got it, yeah. Yeah, well, this was a proper, but this is like one of the larger desks, And so we were based there. And so, because we realised even back then that budgets were getting pressed a little bit. And so if you didn't need to be in one of the main rooms, where you had everything all the time and spending that much money, because it just makes it too expensive for the act. Anyway, as you know, Olympic sadly closed. And so I then moved out of there. Chenzo opened up his mix facility up in Suffolk. I moved over to Moloko Studios in Bermondsey until about 3 years ago. And I was just getting really fed up with the commute across town to that part of London from where I live. And Damon offered me some space in his studio. And so there was so I'm in there basically, and I've got a setup where I've got an Audient Zen desk, which gives me 16 faders. I just now do all my work in there. So I'll go into one of the larger rooms to do the drums and everything. But once I've got that done, guitars, vocals, bits and pieces like that, I can do in my room. And then I mix in there too. And I've got some outboard, some compressors and some EQs and so on. And then I've also got obviously the plugins that I need in the desk. So it's a mix of the digital and analog, really. I
was interested in whether you were still had that console. He was like, make sure you ask him about it, whether he still uses it.
No, I love it. And touch wood, it's working well. It's working fine. The only thing that doesn't work in it now is the MIDI, but I think it's because of the MIDI driver. Since iOS has changed and everything, I can't get the right driver to work with it. So it's all. Because I used to have the MIDI faders kind of to recall the faders, but now I just make notes. I've got a logbook and I make notes of where things are.
I'll mention it to him. I'll give him a call and be like, he loves it, but the MIDI's not working anymore. See what he says.
It's a great little footprint, but it does a lot of work. It's good. Yeah. It does work very well.
Well, designed by David Dearden, whose resume is ridiculous, isn't it? He's another one of those guys. I think he was assisting on didn't he assist on the White Album and things like that? Yeah. Yeah. I love those guys that kind of came up as engineers and techs and great stuff. You've got quite a long association, of course, with Chrissie Hynde and the Pretenders. You just did the new record. Yeah,
I mean it's great. I mean Chrissie's she's a tough cookie, I mean some people I think get on the wrong side of Chrissie and it, but I get on great with her. I get on really great with her. It's funny, actually. I met her back, I think it must have been very beginning of the 90s or something. And because my manager, Gail Coulson, she managed Chrissie at this point. And Chrissie had been asked to do a track for a Jimi Hendrix tribute album. Gail said, could you do this session with Chrissie? And it was kind of a good way of testing the water to see if we would get on great. And at this point, Chrissie had fired Martin, the drummer, Martin Chambers, and she had this session drummer. And I got to the studio and I thought, well, I'm only doing one song. It can either go really well or it'll be a real catastrophe. But so I'm just going to say what I feel, because if I'm out, I'm out. It doesn't matter. It's only. So I walk in and this session drummer's got his kit out and he's got a big cage and he's got about 8 tom-toms going around. And I said to him, you can get rid of all of that. I felt really bullish. I said, I don't think we need more than a floor tom and a single tom on this. because Martin Chambers, that's all he plays with in the Pretenders. And
Makes
also
sense to me.
Jimi Hendrix. I mean, you don't need 80, you don't need that many toms on it, I mean, so and Chrissy loved it. She really loved the fact that I'd come in and taught this session drum, because she hates drums. I mean, she kind of like, she has this thing about, put a screen between me and the drummer because I can't stand it. She gets really kind of, and so anyway, whatever. It worked out great, and we did that particular track, and then so I was invited back to do more work with her, and I think I did some work on The Last of the Independents. I think she'd been in the studio with Ian Stanley, and it was taking Ian's great, but it was taking a lot of money and a lot of time, and she just wanted a producer to go in there with a band, and she invited Martin back at this point, which I thought was great. So
absolutely, yeah.
I kind of very much, I'm very much on Martin's side. When we're doing the drums, the most important person in the band to me is the drummer. The lead singer can just shut up for a bit and let me get on, let me get on with it. And I think she liked that, she liked the fact that I was, driving it on and taking responsibility. So, and that was a long kind of relationship. Well, I did that album and then another one, Viva Amor, I think it was. And then there was a long gap where I didn't do anything with her at all. But as you mentioned, I have just done an album with her, which I'm really proud of. I think it's a real good rock and roll album. And the good thing about it also, I just said to her, let's just pick the best 10 songs. It's not, because you know what it was like back in the 90s, Warren? We were doing like so many, when I did a Blur album, we would do something like 20 songs or something, and then, or even more. And then 17 would go on the album because it was a CD. And the rest of them would be like 2 B-sides for the 7-inch, 2 B-sides for the 12-inch, one for the cassette single. It was so much output. And now it's kind of gone the other way now. And because people are buying vinyl again, I said, let's just make 10 good songs that fit onto 2 sides of vinyl. It's quite a good discipline, And that's what we did. And I think it kind of, it reflects well.
It's a great album. Record. It's a great album, and I'm like all of us, a huge Chrissie Hynde fan. I think that first Pretenders album is one of the most important albums ever, and it ushered in a whole different way to see girls in rock. I think she completely changed the landscape, and I love the new album. There's a few other bands, Catatonia, Kingmaker, that you worked with again in the 90s. I think something that jumps out to me is Terry Hall's solo record. Yeah,
I didn't do the whole album. I just did a few bits and pieces. But I got on very well with Terry. I think the first thing I did for him was a mix. I think he'd been working with Ian Brody and also Chenzo Townsend, because Chenzo was my engineer for a lot of the time in the late 90s. But in the early 90s, Chenzo was Ian Brody's engineer. And then it was when Ian Brody then decided to stop producing records and focus more on the Lightning Seeds and be an act on his own, in his own right. Then Chenzo's management wrote to me and said, would you be interested in working with Chenzo as your engineer? And that's what happened. That's why Chenzo, I think Chenzo worked with me on the Sleeper album, the third Sleeper album. And that was the start of a long relationship that went through till about the mid-2000s. In between the big successes that I had, fortunately, there were some other acts that, didn't have quite the heights of success, but there still were records that I enjoyed making, There was a band called Tiger that I really enjoyed working with. I think that was 1999. And we made an album called Rosaria. And they were an interesting band. They didn't have a bass player. They had a girl guitar player who had played a guitar where every single string was tuned to G, and the bass lines were played on a Moog, but in real time, no sequencing. And they were great. I really enjoyed working with them. They were so different, so fresh, So that was an interesting record to make. But there was a bit of again, I don't like to use the word fallow, but it was a fallow period again, kind of on that cusp of the 2000s when things went a bit flat. Dance music was kind of again the ascendance again. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like dance music, but it was there wasn't much going on guitar-wise. And then suddenly the Strokes happened, and that was great. And then the Libertines happened, and there was a bit of an uplift again in guitar bands, and well-crafted songs as well, So that was good. And so again, coming out of that, there was things like the Ordinary Boys that I worked with, and then Kaiser Chiefs. and
I
that
wanted
kind
to
of
get to
Baby
the Kaiser
Shambles.
Chiefs. Yeah.
So that was the thing that's kind of came in for me in the 2000s. But it really was because I think, everything goes in cycles and waves, and the Strokes kind of kickstarted that again. It was kids were going out and buying guitars again, rather than buying decks, and samplers. So it was good.
Yeah, and the Kaiser Chiefs, in particular for me, I think really exemplified that ability to mix rock and roll and dance music together. I mean, really took the best of both, and it was a really great.
There's a good pop sensibility to what they do. I mean, Nick, the drummer, who was the main writer, he's a very clever guy and really knows his stuff. But that was an interesting thing. That was another thing that nearly didn't happen. What happened was the Ordinary Boys. I mean, their first album, their debut album is a cracking record. Actually, I'm very proud of that. And it's a really good record. And they were touring that record, and the Kaiser Chiefs were a support act. And I actually got to one of the shows. I'd missed the Kaiser Chiefs because I was a bit late. And it was after the show. I was talking with the Ordinary Boys backstage, and Nick, the drummer of the Kaisers, came up to me and thrust his CD in my hand and said, I'm Nick from the Kaiser Chiefs, would love to work with you. Would you ever listen to this CD? So I took it away. And then literally the next day, I think Be Unique, the record label, phoned me and said, we're thinking of signing the Kaiser Chiefs, Stephen. Could you do a session with them and see how it works out?
Oh, wow.
So I said, yeah, great. Okay. So we went in to the little studio that Chenzo and I run we ran in Olympic. And we had Nick, who had a tiny little area where we could do a drum kit, and everybody else had to be in the control room. And we did the session for I Predict a Riot. And that's it. That's the test session. And that was the track that, and I played it to the label. And they went, yeah, we like this. We're signing them. So,
You seem to have a bit of a track record of the first song you do is the massive hit.
Well, it's not a bad trait, really, if you can do it.
Not bad at all. I'd take it.
But yeah, no, it was great. It did work out really, really well. And it was funny because then the label said to me, we want you to go back in and do Oh My God. I went, so because that was on the demo CD that they gave me. And I said, well, I like that one. I said, but there's a track they do live, which I really, really like. Because by this point I had seen them play live. And it's called Every Day I Love You Less and Less. So they said, just do both of them then. So I did both of those. And they were both top 10 hits. So I've never had a run like that, 3 singles. You know what I mean? That were just like bang, 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 all hits. And it was really frustrating because they wanted me to do the whole album. And I said, look, I can't because I'm halfway through a New Order album. And it's well documented that New Order albums take, a long, 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 long time. And, they were kind of dragging on with this. So I had to kind of say, look, guys, I can only do the first, like half the album. I've only got time to do that because I've got to be back in the studio with New Order in 2 weeks' time. And so that was it. So although I did all the hits on that first album, I'm only on half the album.
New Order was the next one that was coming up for me. I mean, I assume you must have been a huge Joy Division / New Order fan.
I was really, really kind of excited, a bit nervous because, I hold them in such high, kind of reverence, and I think they're fantastic, but I really love them. And I went up to meet them and I got on really well. I mean, Hookie's got great sense of humor, really funny guy. I enjoyed all their company. Actually, they were lovely people. And but I was very keen to kind of get them back to a sound that I love Vigilantes. I think for me that track particularly is a sound where I think New Order get it right. There's a little element of rock in there, but it's still got that kind of the thing we love about New Order, which is the synthesis to a certain degree. And we made this album, but the problem is that there was just too much material being put forward all the time. And while we were working on tracks that we thought were because they've been writing for ages and ages and ages. And so my idea was, let's just pick the best, go in there and work on that. But Bernard was always going off while we were working on some things. He was going from writing new songs, which were much more electronic based, like everything was sequenced, everything was it. And he wanted those on the album. So there were a lot of really great tracks that we made that didn't actually go on that record in the end. It was a bit of a kind of mismatch. So it's an album that I enjoyed the session, but I'm not really happy with the way it all turned out. I don't think they are either, really. But there's a few key things. I really love Turn, which is one of my favorite tracks on that record. And that was the kind of what I was trying to get at, really, on that record, that kind of thing, But it's a shame because they're split up, and I'd love to see Hooky back in the fold myself. But there's obviously a lot of blood between the two kind of parties, and it's a shame really, because I think they're at their best when they work together. I really do.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I'm a huge Peter Hook fan. I've got 2 of his basses hanging on my wall. I mean, to me, it's like it's a whole. He was a defining moment for bass players. Suddenly, like, oh, you can play a melody.
yeah.
I mean, some of his bass lines are the songs. I mean, it's the vocal melody is his bass line.
But it's funny. What I love about Peter though is that he's a real non-musician, in the sense that I always remember I was working with him, and I said to him, Pete, when you're sliding up from the F to the G there, and he goes, what do you mean F to G? I said, what do you mean? Oh, from this fret to that fret. I said, yeah. I said, that's what I love about him. He just does what he does. He hears he jams on it. He gets he'll get a vibe, and then it goes down. He doesn't really think about it too much, I don't think.
Yeah. Well, he doesn't have any sort of convention. You think of like Joy Division, like Transmission, that the bass, like, I mean, nobody plays a bass like that. He just seems to be like picking and grabbing the strings and just going and it just creates a pulse.
Yeah,
that is so unique. It takes a bass and just makes it be whatever he wants it to be.
They are iconic. The Joy Division, New Order. What those guys have managed to make will always is there forever now. It will never. They'll always be held in high esteem, I think.
They're sort of Joy Division are basically our Velvet Underground, the band that every musician listened to. And then started their own band. Yeah,
absolutely. It's a musicians band.
Yeah. Couple of other great bands. A personal favorite of mine, the Zoutons. Absolutely love that band.
Yeah, that was a real buzz working with them. I went up to Liverpool to go and meet them, and I remember going into the rehearsal room because I really loved the singles from their first album that Ian Brody had produced, and I thought he'd done a really good job. So I was kind of surprised they weren't working with him again, but I was offered the gig, so I was like, yeah, I definitely would like to do it. And I remember going up, and they just sat up opposite me in this rehearsal room and just played at me. And the force, it wasn't the volume, it was just the performance. It was really like as if they were playing a show for me. They really played their hearts out. It was incredible. And I was just, the musicianship, especially the rhythm section, incredible, absolutely incredible.
Great drummer, yeah.
And I was like, yeah, I definitely want to do this. And we went in and we made an album. Chenzo engineered that record for me. We recorded it at Townhouse Studios, another great studio, which unfortunately is no longer with us, and made this great record, a great kind of album that I just really enjoyed, making. It was a real joy. I can't add much more than to say that they could really play. They really could, and their songs were great. And we did Valerie. I knew it was a good song. But I didn't know it. Obviously the Mark Ronson version, kind of helped with Amy, kind of helped push it to a wider audience. But I still love the version we've done, that we had done, and I still think it stands up pretty well.
I did a mic demo a couple of months ago, and the song I covered was the Zoutons version of Valerie.
Right.
And then the drummer wrote to me and said, "Oh, thanks for doing that. It was great." It's just like, I know, I love your version of that. It's absolutely superb. And it reminds me so much of the Kinks. It's got that same kind of sensibility.
Absolutely. I'm glad you picked up on that, because that was kind of in the back of my mind while we were making some of the tracks on that record. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's that little R&B kind of thing, isn't there? That influence, that kind of 60s R&B thing that kind of underpins it. Yeah. Yeah. Soulfulness. There's a soulfulness.
Great guitar player as well. Just like really harps back to like those kind of little double stop parts that he plays are just absolutely beautiful. Yeah. Feeder was another great band of that period.
Didn't do a whole album, but again, I was invited to do a few. I think they were doing the greatest hits, and they wanted to do 2 new tracks. You often bands do a greatest hits. So I like to put a couple of new tracks on. Got on really well with them, actually. Grant, isn't it, is the lead singer? Really lovely fella. We got on very well. To be honest with you, I think he had such a clear idea of what he really, really wanted. I don't know really whether he really needed me. To be honest with you, I did kind of feel sometimes like, are you going to listen to what I've got to say, or shall I not bother? But we did get on very well, and yeah, they're great. I mean, again, Feeder, what a great pop rock band. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, those classic early Feeder singles are just full of hooks. Really incredible.
Yep.
Hook after hook after hook. You know, really, really cool. But yeah, but it was just 2 tracks that are on the greatest hits as far as I can remember. So I can't say I remember too much about it, to be honest with you.
So we touched on a couple of the bands. You were saying the Strokes, and then of course in Britain it was the Libertines, the other band that really kind of made it okay again in the 2000s to play guitars. And Baby Shambles, of course, came out of the ashes of the Libertines. So how did that all come about?
Well, I was a huge Libertines fan, but I also liked the some of the stuff that I'd heard on the first Libertines album. I was approached by the label to ask if I would be happy to work with Baby Shambles. I thought, yeah, I'd be up for this, because I could definitely see, again, you know, there's that kind of thing, Smiths, Libertines, you know, I could see, although they're very different sounding, there's an appreciation of the same kind of songwriting there, you know. And so I was like, yeah, I definitely would be up for that. So we went in the studio, and this is for Shotter's Nation, which is the second Baby Shambles album. But little did I know what I was letting myself in for. I mean, Pete had a reputation, but I didn't realise it was going to be as tricky as it was. And this is the time when he was dating Kate Moss, so there was paparazzi everywhere, and it was very vampiric people hanging around him. Is that the right term? A lot of the wrong sort hanging around, you know, and I just hated it, that. But when I could get Pete on his own with the band and actually focus on things, it was great. I really enjoyed making that record. But there were a couple of times I had to kind of fire a warning shot across Pete's bow, as it were, and say, look, pull yourself together, you know, this isn't good enough. You're going to have to really sort this out. But I did not want to let down Drew and Adam, the rhythm section in the band. I know, as far as I'm concerned, I was signed up to make this record, and I was sure as hell going to make it. But there were times it was a struggle. But we got there in the end, and I think actually the record is a fine,
it's a great record.
Album.
Yeah, great record.
Yeah.
Some Primal Scream. I don't want to go over that. I want to mix past that.
That is the one. I was talking about this with my journalist friend recently, Pete Perfides, and because he asked me about Primal Scream. That's the one record where I had to put up my hand and say it didn't work out. This is the first album, the very, very, very first album back in the early 80s or mid 80s, 87. Yeah, 87, 88. I tried to make a record with them. They were falling apart. They were arguing all the time. Bobby didn't like the drummer. The drummer, you know, couldn't keep time. Bobby wasn't the best tuning wise at the time. You know, there was a 12-string guitar player who couldn't keep his 12-string guitar in tune. It was a nightmare. It drove me up the bloody wall, to be honest with you. And we tried to salvage it by getting Andrew Innes in, who was a friend of Alan McGee's. And I got on very well with Andrew, and we kind of nearly salvaged it, but it's still too much water had gone under the bridge. It wasn't working. So that was the one record where I had to say, sorry, I can't do this. And we went different ways. But ironically, what happened was, I think mid-2000s, I did end up back in the studio with them again. We did do a track. I think it was a one-off, you know, single. And that was actually quite a pleasurable experience. Actually, it was a good session. You know, they'd grown up and matured and become much better musicians, and I'd learned a lot more as well. And so it was a good coming together. It was good, but again, it was just that one track.
Yep. No, great. Still fantastic to be able to like have your fingers in all these multiple pies of bands that were hugely influential. Because of course, Screamadelica like came out like a massive explosion. Yeah. So great to be able to work with them. Now you carried on working with the Cranberries. Now is this a greatest hits gold? Is that a greatest hits record?
Yeah, there was
okay.
So what happened was, after the first 2 Cranberries albums, I mean, the second album, No Need to Argue, was just mega. I just went huge. I mean, that Zombie single was just blew them up worldwide. But then there was a bit of an egotistical development. About, you know, I don't want to talk badly of Dolores, bless her, may she rest in peace. But I was kind of, she wanted a co-production credit on the record when we'd finished it. I was like, no, I produced this record. She kind of came back and said, well, I wrote the string parts. I'm like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean you produced it. And I was kind of threatened. You either agree to a co-production credit or we won't work with you again. So I went, don't work with me again then. You know, I'm not caving in. I produced this record. I was there every single minute of every single overdub that went down on that record. I was there. She wasn't, So, but whatever, I don't want to talk badly of her, especially, in light of, her passing. But I stood up for myself and I was threatened and I said, no, I'm not going to cave in. So I didn't work with them for many years. And then they kind of went off and did records with other people. And then they came back to me, I think early 2000s. And I did some tracks with them for, again, 2 new songs for Greatest Hits. Then we did another proper complete album. And then, as you know, sadly, Dolores passed away a couple of years back now. And they were already working towards a new album. And they've been swapping files backwards and forwards across the Atlantic, compiling a new batch of songs. And Noel wrote to me and said, look, we feel as a band we want to finish this album. It's kind of in tribute to Dolores more than anything else. And I said to him, well, send me what you've got. I said, but we don't want to be accused of scraping the barrel. And if we work on it and we're not totally happy with the results, we've got to let it go. We've got to rest it. We can't, So I asked him to send me everything that he had. And this is the great advantage of Pro Tools now. I could go through all the playlists and see if I could find new vocal takes in the background and stuff. And I just went through everything, edited things around to make things a bit longer, because sometimes they were literally like a sketch, first chorus, and it finished. It needed to be stretched out a bit or whatever. And I did what I could with that. And then once I felt I got that ready for the band to come in, they literally used these then as like glorified click tracks to come in and play on. And some tracks Dolores had done with some session musicians in America, because she was always also writing songs. Sometimes she wasn't sure whether it would be for a solo work or for the Cranberries. So the case there would be like to listen to what they've done, but then take all that session playing stuff off and then just put the band on. There were a couple of overdubs that we kept because I felt they were right, and the people got the right credit for that as well. But it was a case of getting the band playing on it again, and that's how we made that album. And I was very proud of how it turned out, and I felt it deserved to be released. And it came out and it got a warm reception, because I was really worried that people would be kind of casting dispersions on our intentions and so on, but it was all done with the deepest respect and love, really. And it was tough for the band, because they went in the studio and I've got these sessions prepared for them to start playing on, and they're putting on their headphones and they're hearing Dolores's voice in their heads, and she's not there. It's tough, And I always remember the last day of doing the drums. I remember Fergal and Mikey come in. They were playing together as a rhythm section, and they came in. And it was like, that's it. That's the last time they're going to be playing together, because they know they can't tour. They know they can't make another record. That was it. And it was quite a traumatic, emotional moment.
So, of course, after Blur, well, I don't know if they're broken up now or they're together on hiatus, but obviously you've continued working with our good friend, the rather wonderful Graham Coxon.
Yeah, I've made more records with Graham than any other person.
Amazing.
I've made, because if you think about it, I think I've made 6 Blur albums.
Yep.
3 Graham Coxon solo records, and then he also featured on Pete Doherty's solo record. So, I've sat next to him in the control room more than any other person, and I'm very proud of that fact. I mean, what a player! I mean, I can sit and watch Graham play, and I'm going, he's entertaining me, let alone worrying about entertaining people by recording what we were recording. It's just a dream to be sitting next to him while he's playing. I just love working with the guy. It was fantastic. But what happened was, after the Blur album, Graham had done an interview, and that was for the next album, which was 13, I think it was. Yeah, it was. And it was an interview, and basically the journalist had asked him about the making of this new album, and I think he said something along the lines, "Oh, this is the first album I've enjoyed making," and that really hurt me. I was like, "Really?" So I kind of let the management know that I was a bit upset by that comment, And then anyway, it went by the book, and about years later, about mid-2000s, Graham gets in contact with me through the management, saying he's interested in working with me. And by this point, he'd already put out 2 or 3 solo records, and I was like, "Really? I want to hear it from Graham in person. Is it the label want me to work with him, or is it?" I said, "I'll only do it if it's Graham that wants me to do it. I don't want it to be EMI's idea. I wanted it to be Graham's idea. Anyway, I went to see him play a show, and we sat down backstage afterwards, and we had a real good heart to heart. And he opened up, and he just said that I was drinking then, and I said nasty things because I wanted to say nasty things. You know, he was angry with himself. So we went in and we did what became Happiness in Magazines. And it was incredible because it was just me and him and the engineer. Because Graham would literally put down a very simple little drum machine pattern, play the guitar roughly to that on top, and then that would be his click track. And then he goes in and plays drums, and then he just builds it up from there. And it was incredible. He did everything on that record. You know, I think there might have been one or two overdubs by other people, but pretty much everything. But it sounds like a band playing. It's really good. You know, it was a good record to make, and so that carried on. So I made 2 more albums with him after that, and then I got him involved in the Pete Doherty thing. because I really wanted to get Peter to focus, and I thought if I get someone of the caliber of Graham Coxon to come in and play on it, hopefully that will make Peter focus. And it did. And in fact, that album, I'm really proud of. You know, his solo record too. You know, Grace Wastelands. The reason why it worked is because Graham helped me on that record. He came, you know, him being there alongside me and Pete helped make Pete focus. So it was good.
We talked about Suede, you know, the whole Suede Blur thing, but we didn't actually talk about you working with Suede.
Yeah, that was a bit of a kind of a bolt out the blue. Again, I think that was early 2000s or thereabouts. Yeah, I mean, obviously I was in the Blur camp, but I was a big fan of what Suede did. You know, I mean, those first 2 albums are incredible. I mean, in fact, the first 3 albums. I mean, I was a big fan anyway. I just liked what they were doing. And so, yeah, I jumped at the chance to work with them. They'd been through the mill, though, with this album. They'd made the album completely with another producer, spent a fortune on it, and weren't happy with it. So it was one of those albums. We didn't go into it in the band weren't in the best of moods. They were a bit worn out on it, to be honest with you. And they had a new keyboard player. It wasn't Neil Codling. It was another guy. And I don't think he fitted in as well as, the chemistry wasn't there. And I think Brett was a little bit, his head was off, perhaps somewhere else, thinking about his solo work, whatever. It didn't, you know, there's moments on there which are really good. I think Obsessions is a great track. I think that's really, you know, a great classic Suede track. But there's something not quite right about that record. And I think it was just because they've been through the mill making it. And I don't know whether the actual enthusiasm was kind of sustained throughout the recording of the record, unfortunately. But I'm very proud of the fact that they asked me to work with them, and you know, they're great people. I love them. I think they're great guys.
I think Obsessions is good. I think Beautiful Losers is a great song. There's some great stuff on there. It was always going to be tough because they were so, from a musician perspective at least, you know, having Bernard lead the band all those years ago, obviously before that, was kind of a bit of a sucker punch because it was that interplay between, you know, everybody was reviewing it as kind of a Bowie, Mick Ronson feel. Yeah. Because you had this androgynous kind of lead singer with this almost classic rock guitar player playing Mick Ronson kind of style riffs. So, yeah. But I enjoyed that record. It's interesting, isn't it? Because it must be, as a producer, you separating yourself from how it feels like in the room making a record from actually hearing it. I imagine going back to it now, you'll probably be like, "Oh, that was actually a really good record."
Yeah.
We didn't talk about the Courtineers. Is that how you pronounce it?
Cortinas.
Yeah, Cortinas. Yeah,
Cortinas, of course it is.
Yeah. Why did I say Cortinas?
No, I mean, again, the record label approached me, said, "Would you like to work with this band?" Some people think I approached them. I didn't. I don't know where that story's come from. They approached me. I heard the demos, and I was like, "Yeah, I really like this." Again, great guitar band. That first album, for me, is I love the arrogance. Liam's vocal, that lyric. I'm like a Morrissey without strings. No, a Morrissey with strings. That's it, because he's a guitar player. I thought they were great. And Not 19 Forever is a classic. It really is, you know. Again, just really good, concise guitar, you know, pop rock songs. And I just wanted to capture the energy. I saw them play a gig in Manchester. I went up to see them play at the university in Manchester, and they blew me away. They were just like, I thought, I've just got to if I can capture that, if I can capture this, you know, them as they are, and you know, kind of get that onto tape, but get it right, I'll be happy. And I think we did. It's a good album. St. Jude's a good album.
I agree. I think something that I really strongly believe about your work and that you're touching on there is your ability to balance credible art with pop music. I mean, obviously that's something that is twofold, that you bring to it, but also you have those ears. You're listening out for that. Is that just a conscious thing?
Yeah, as I said, earlier, I'm a pop fan, really. I mean, I grew up on Bolan and Bowie. I can remember when at school, the older age groups would be sneering at us, holding their kind of, Led Zeppelin albums under their arm, while we're holding T-Rex and Bowie, and Roxy music, and that kind of stuff. But they were great pop records, I mean, I've always grown up. I think, if you can say what you want to say in 3.5 minutes, that's brilliant. Don't give me like 2 minutes of guitar solos. I'm not interested. Right. There was a time when we all got into a little bit of prog rock in the mid 70s, where kind of really but to be honest with you, at heart, really, I prefer just say what you got to say, 3.5 minutes, 4 at the most, if you can, and then get on, give us the next song,
I agree. I'm the same way. I feel like we were touching off camera for a second, was the sort of the Genesis thing. I love Genesis, but what I love Genesis is when they nail the whole thing together and they give me a pop song with all the cleverness and everything. And then I'm like, it's like that to me is I want it all.
Yeah. I mean, my first Genesis record was I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe, which is a great pop single.
Yeah.
Because it had a proper chorus on it,
Yeah.
Which is not something you actually heard on Genesis songs very often those days.
Yeah.
But I love it. I'm a bit of a sucker for it, really. Give me a great kind of Roxy or Mott the Hoople or Bowie single from those periods, and it brings back so many memories. I mean, it really does. It means a lot to me, that stuff.
Virginia Plain, Pajama Rama, Love Is the Drug.
Virginia Plain, what a debut single! I mean, I don't think there is a better debut single, is there, by any act? No. Incredible.